My name is Helen Collins, and I'm 29 years old. I work as a librarian in a small town that most people have probably never even heard of. Here, everything is quiet and peaceful. Time moves at a slower pace, almost as if it reflects my life. My life is simple, perhaps, to some, too simple, but for me, it's my life, and I'm not looking for change. I've always been one of those people they call quiet. I'm much more at ease in the company of books than in the loud and often chaotic outside world. The library isn't just a place of work for me, it's my refuge, my own little kingdom of calm and a hidden retreat. It's an old, cozy building with creaky wooden floors and massive bookshelves that hold memories of days long past. For some, it may be insignificant, old, and worn, but to me, every corner here is beautiful. Every morning begins the same way, but strangely, this routine brings me joy. I open the doors at 8 a.m., switch on the dim lights illuminating the shelves, and breathe in that indescribable scent of old pages mingled with a faint touch of wood. It's a smell I love, one that stirs warmth and happiness within me. It's the little things like this that make me feel truly at home. My parents passed away when I was still a little girl, and all I have left of them are the stories my grandmother used to tell me, the very woman who raised me with love and care. She was kind and wise, always encouraging me to read and seek knowledge, believing that books would be a source of strength for me in any life situation. But now she's gone too, leaving quietly, just as she lived, and leaving me alone with myself and the world she once helped me create. I have no brothers, no sisters, no close relatives, just me, surrounded by books, memories, and the quiet sounds of empty halls. Sometimes, it feels like my only friends are the regular visitors to the library. Take Mr. Jenkins, for instance, a somewhat stooped elderly man with kind eyes who comes in every morning without fail. He spends hours in silence, absorbed in thick volumes of history. "Good morning, Helen," he greets me as soon as he steps in, as if to confirm my thoughts. "Good morning, Mr. Jenkins," I reply with a smile. "A new batch of history books arrived yesterday. I set one aside just for you." "Oh, Helen, you know me far too well, dear," he laughs, making his way to his usual shelf. And so my day passes. Familiar faces, familiar routines. I help children find books for their school projects, recommend Mrs. Harrison her favorite romance novels, and guide Mr. Thompson to the science fiction shelves. Here, everyone knows what they want, and I am part of this small, unchanging circle. This predictability, this routine, is a source of comfort for me. But one day, Jack stepped into my quiet world. I noticed him the moment he crossed the library's threshold. Tall, confident, not the kind of person who typically wandered in here. His suit looked so neat and elegant, it was as if he'd come from an entirely different world, where different rules and rhythms prevailed. "Could you help me find a book?" he asked. His voice was calm, yet there was a certain insistence in it that was impossible to ignore. Of course, I nodded, feeling a slight thrill creep into my heart. "What are you looking for?" "The novel The Great Gatsby." "I think it'll do," Jack replied, looking a bit sheepish, and I thought I glimpsed a hidden meaning in his eyes. I led him to the shelf where the classics were kept and reached for the book. Our hands brushed accidentally, and I felt a faint jolt run through me at that simple, fleeting touch. It was just a brief moment, yet it lingered in my mind as though it had left an indelible mark. "Thank you, Helen," he said, reading my name badge. "I'm Jack. Nice to meet you." That brief introduction turned out to be much more than I could have imagined at the time. It became the start of a new chapter in my life, a chapter filled with joy and hope, but later with bitterness and betrayal. If only I'd known then what lay ahead, but life, unfortunately, doesn't come with warning signs. Sometimes, we get swept into a whirlwind of events, utterly unprepared. After that first encounter, Jack began showing up at the library more and more often. At first, he didn't even seem sure of what he was looking for, but each time, he'd come to me, asking for a book recommendation, lingering a few minutes for a conversation. On one of those days, he came in just as I was struggling to lift a heavy box of new arrivals onto a shelf. "Need a hand?" he asked with a faint smile, noticing my effort. "Oh, that would be wonderful, thank you," I sighed in relief, stepping aside to let him help. Together, we began shelving the books, and during the process, Jack suddenly asked, "Helen, what brought you here?" "Why the library?" I paused, thinking for a moment before replying. I've always felt that books are like friends. Reliable and quiet, they never let you down. Plus, it's peaceful here. I love the silence." Jack laughed. His laughter was warm, genuine, and it seemed to light up the space around us. "I can see that this is a completely different world," he said with a hint of wonder in his voice. With each visit, our conversations grew longer. I learned that Jack worked in the family real estate business. He spoke about it casually, not without irony, and sometimes even with a hint of weariness. I could tell he felt somewhat out of place in the world he came from. Perhaps that was what made our conversations feel so natural. Both of us sensed we didn't quite belong in the realities that surrounded us. At some point, I realized I was looking forward to his visits, waiting for that moment when he'd walk through the library doors and our eyes would meet. His presence became a small adventure in my quiet life, something I had come to cherish. And then, one day, he surprised me. "Helen, would you like to have dinner with me tonight?" There was a soft, reassuring look on his face, and it took me a moment to understand what he meant. "Like a date?" I asked, feeling my heart skip a beat. "Yes, like a date," he replied with a smile. I hesitated, feeling a slight fear of the unknown. It was uncharted territory for me, and it felt as if I were standing on the edge of something vast and daunting. But there was something about Jack that filled me with trust, something sincere and genuine, so I took a deep breath and said, "All right, yes, I'd like that." We went to a small restaurant, cozy but modest, with soft lighting and quiet music playing in the background. We talked about everything: books and movies, childhood memories, and dreams for the future. I found myself laughing, sharing stories, and feeling truly happy. For a few hours, I forgot about everything: the library, the routine, the loneliness. It was as if, for one evening, I was living a life I'd never known before. By the time we left the restaurant, the evening had faded into dusk, and the city was wrapped in a blanket of calm and silence. We walked down the empty streets, and Jack turned to me with warmth in his eyes and said, "This was a wonderful evening, Helen. You're nothing like the people I usually spend time with." I didn't know what to say. Embarrassed, I simply smiled, lowering my gaze, yet I felt my heart beat faster at his words, as if he'd seen something in me that had remained hidden from everyone else. He continued, almost hesitantly, as if he feared he might startle me, "I'd like to see you again, if that's all right with you." I felt my heart flutter in my chest, and I simply nodded, "Yes. I'd like that too." Since then, Jack and I started seeing each other more often. He frequently invited me to dinner, and sometimes we would simply stroll through the narrow streets of my hometown. These walks became something special to me. I, always so quiet and reserved, felt like I was living a new life with him, one that included not only books and silence but also conversations, laughter, and the anticipation of each new date. Over time, I realized I had fallen in love with him. Jack was charming, attentive, and surrounded me with a warmth I had long since stopped expecting from anyone. He made me feel special, gave me the confidence that I was worthy of love. So, one evening, when he unexpectedly proposed, I didn't hesitate. I said, "Yes." Looking back now, I sometimes wonder, what if I had noticed something? Something that might have warned me, shown me a glimpse of deception behind his dazzling charm. But love has an incredible way of blinding us, clouding our judgment, and I was so deeply immersed in my feelings that I simply couldn't see the signs. Or maybe I just didn't want to see them. After Jack and I got engaged, everything began to change. The first obstacle was his parents. They disapproved of me from the start, convinced I wasn't a suitable match for their son. On the night of our first dinner at their home, I arrived trembling with nervousness, hoping to make a good impression. The house was enormous, extravagantly furnished, luxurious, completely different from anything I was used to. Tension hung in the air, palpable from the moment I stepped inside. "Helen, this is my mother, Margaret, and my father, Richard," Jack introduced us, his voice reassuring. "It's a pleasure to meet you," I said, trying to smile, though I felt my confidence wane under Margaret's piercing gaze. "So, you're the girl who works at the library?" she asked dryly, giving me a scrutinizing look. "Yes, that's right," I replied, feeling myself shrink under her cold stare. Unable to hold back, Richard added a cutting remark, "Jack, you really couldn't find someone more suitable?" Each word felt like a needle piercing my heart. I wanted to disappear, to sink into the ground and not hear their disdain, that disapproval radiating from people so close to Jack. The dinner was long and felt like it would never end. They didn't even try to hide their contempt, and despite the hurt I felt inside, I sat there patiently, smiling and pretending not to notice, hoping it was just my imagination. But Jack, seeing how affected I was, squeezed my hand under the table and, breaking the icy atmosphere, calmly said, "Mom, Dad, Helen is my choice. She makes me happy, and that's what matters most." That moment of him standing up for me gave me a sense of support. I felt my heart beat faster, and a blush spread across my cheeks, knowing Jack seemed ready to defend me, even in front of those closest to him. I loved him even more for that, as it felt like we had something strong, something capable of overcoming any obstacle. But soon, other challenges began. Right before the wedding, his parents insisted on a prenuptial agreement. They assured me it was just a formality, that I had nothing to lose. I agreed without protest. I had no interest in material gains, and I believed in Jack's love, his loyalty, and his sincerity. The idea of financial calculations felt foreign to me. After the wedding, I moved into Jack's house, which was actually a gift from his parents. They presented it as a wedding present, but it soon became clear that, in their eyes, the house still belonged to them. His parents began appearing at our home more and more frequently, without warning. They didn't seem to view it as our family home but rather as their domain, and with each visit, their presence filled the house with an uninvited chill of control. As soon as Margaret crossed the threshold, her voice would fill the home with an authoritative tone. "Helen, make us some coffee," she'd say, barely looking at me, as if I were just a servant here. Without a word, I'd head to the kitchen and fulfill her request, though it caused me inner pain. I didn't want to make a scene, didn't want to further complicate the already strained relationship. I thought that restraint and patience might ease the situation, but I was wrong. One day, while glancing over our TV, Margaret casually remarked, "Remember, Helen, if you two divorce, you'll have no claim on this. Or on anything else in this house." I tried to hide how much it hurt to hear such words, but the constant reminders that nothing in this house belonged to me gnawed away at me. Everything that had once mattered to Jack seemed to lose its importance. He started to change too. I noticed that not only had he stopped defending me, but, even worse, he had begun joining in on his parents' sarcastic jokes. One evening, as I was getting ready for yet another family event, I stood hesitating between two outfits and asked Jack for advice. Instead of the support I expected, he looked at me with a smirk and said, "You look less dull in that one." Those words cut me like a knife. It was as if a stranger stood before me, not the Jack I once fell in love with, not the one who had once defended me against his parents. In their company, he became cold, almost distant, and each word he spoke brought me deeper pain. Life in that house was turning into torment. I felt like an uninvited guest, unwanted and unwelcome. Every day, I prayed for the situation to change, but things only got worse. I began to suffer from intense stress, which I tried to ignore, but my body couldn't handle it. I started having constant stomach pains, but stubbornly tried to brush them off, until one day, I collapsed right in the library. When I came to, I found myself in a hospital room. The doctor informed me that my condition was stress-related and that I needed rest. I spent a few days in the hospital, waiting, hoping Jack would visit or at least call. But the days dragged on, and he never appeared. Surrounded by indifference, I felt incredibly lonely and broken. Then, one day, the door opened, and a notary walked in with unexpected news. It turned out that my distant relative, my great-aunt, whom I barely remembered, had passed away, leaving me an inheritance of $30 million. I couldn't believe it. It felt like some strange dream. I'd never imagined I would ever have such money, but now everything had changed. I was no longer the poor librarian, living in the shadow of others. When Jack and his parents found out, they practically burst into my hospital room. Their faces lit up with smiles I had never seen before, and their voices were filled with false excitement and feigned concern. "Dear, we're so happy for you," Margaret purred, grabbing my hand, her voice as sweet as poisoned honey. "Yes, we're family and need to support each other," Richard added with a smile that never reached his eyes. But I couldn't believe this sudden shift. As soon as they stepped out, I heard their muffled voices outside the door, unaware that I could hear their conversation. "She's such a fool," Margaret whispered. "Can you believe our luck? We need to make sure she doesn't leave you, Jack," Richard chuckled. "Maybe you should think about having a child with her," Margaret suggested. "That will certainly keep her around." At that moment, it felt as though lightning had struck me. Every illusion, every bit of love, all the feelings I once had for Jack dissolved like smoke, leaving only a deep pain and utter disgust. These people didn't care about me. They just craved my money. At that moment, I realized what I needed to do: get out of that house, away from people who had betrayed and disappointed me. I had to reclaim my life and my freedom, to take charge of my own fate and stop being their victim. And with that thought, I left the hospital, firmly resolved to act. When I arrived home, Jack and his parents were already waiting for me, their faces lit up with insincere smiles, pretending as if they had spent all these days thinking only of me. "Oh, Helen, we were so worried about you," Margaret exclaimed with exaggerated concern. I nodded briefly, holding back my inner contempt, but said nothing. I knew I had to be cautious, not to reveal my intentions just yet. They couldn't imagine that I had seen their true faces. Jack came closer, and with barely hidden impatience, asked, "When will you receive the inheritance?" His voice was slightly hurried, betraying him completely. I looked at him, the man I once thought I loved, and suddenly realized that he was a stranger to me. I held my breath, looking into those eyes that once seemed so familiar. "Don't worry, you have nothing to fear," I replied, forcing myself to smile. His expression softened a little, though greed was still evident in his voice. "We're married, Helen. What's yours belongs to me too." "Of course, dear," I tilted my head slightly, putting on another smile. That night, I couldn't sleep. Their words echoed in my mind like a poisonous refrain. Their fake concern, shameless greed, and sheer avarice tore me apart, and I knew I had to act immediately. I got out of bed, took out a notebook, and began writing down everything they had done, everything they had said over the past months, as if a dam that had held back too long had finally burst. I poured into those lines everything I had endured, everything that had been building up inside me for years. In the morning, I met with a lawyer. I explained everything to him, showed him the prenuptial agreement, and to my relief, he was on my side. He listened carefully, read the contract, and his brow furrowed as he spoke. "This agreement fully protects you. You're doing the right thing, Helen," he said, confidently squeezing my hand. When I returned home, Jack and his parents, as usual, were settled in the living room. Their heads turned toward me as I entered the room. Richard's face lit up with a mocking smile that sent a chill through me. "There she is, our brave little girl," he said with a sneer, devoid of any warmth. I sat down across from them, clutching my purse in my hands. Inside, I was boiling, but outwardly, I maintained absolute calm. Gathering my thoughts, I spoke in a firm voice. "I have something to say." They stared at me with curiosity, completely unaware that what they were about to hear would turn their world upside down. I held a pause, weighing each sound, every word that was about to leave my lips. "I'm filing for divorce," I said in an even tone, holding their gaze. The room fell into an icy silence. The next moment, Margaret leapt to her feet, her face flushed with fury, and she snarled, "How dare you, you ungrateful girl!" Jack also stood, a look of confusion flashing in his eyes. "Helen, you can't be serious. We love you," he said, struggling to keep his voice steady, but this time, I saw right through him. "You love me?" My voice was cold. "Because I don't feel loved. I feel used. This isn't over. We'll take you to court and claim half of your inheritance." Margaret spat, her eyes blazing with anger. Keeping my composure, I reached into my purse and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, a copy of the prenuptial agreement. Unfolding it, I said, without breaking eye contact, "Actually, you can't claim anything. It says right here in black and white that neither of us has any rights to the other's assets in the event of a divorce." Margaret staggered back, as if she'd been struck. They were speechless. For the first time, I felt that everything was in my hands. Rising, I held the copy of the prenuptial agreement and firmly said, "I'm leaving. And I don't want any of you ever to contact me again." I walked toward the door, ignoring the shouts and insults that erupted behind me. It was the hardest decision of my life, but with each step down the driveway, I felt the weight that had held me down slowly lifting, as though a breath of relief was finally escaping my chest. I was free. Free from their contempt, from manipulation, from cold control. For the first time in a long time, I could breathe fully. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I was certain the future would be brighter and purer than everything I'd left behind. I rented a small apartment in the city. It was modest, maybe even a bit cramped, but it was mine, a space that belonged only to me. I felt at peace again. Life had finally returned to the rhythm and quiet I'd been longing for. Despite the weight of the divorce, I felt that I could handle it, that one day I'd be able to let go of all that burden. A few weeks later, I received a call from my lawyer. "Helen," he began, "there's something you need to know about your great-aunt's will." "What is it?" I asked, feeling a faint sense of unease. "There's a condition in the will. Part of the inheritance must be spent on charitable purposes." It was her final wish. I was surprised and, to be honest, a little taken aback. I barely knew my great-aunt and, of course, hadn't known about her intentions. The lawyer continued, "She was a true philanthropist, Helen. It seems she wanted to pass on this desire to do good to you." After I hung up, I sat for a long time, lost in thought. Here was a chance to do something more, to make a contribution to the lives of others. It felt like a sign, a new direction that I couldn't ignore. I decided that I would find a way to invest these funds in something that would truly change someone's life. As I began researching charities, I felt a growing desire to do something meaningful. I came across a small organization that helped women who had survived domestic violence, offering them shelter and support. This deeply moved me, resonating with something inside. I reached out to them and arranged a meeting. The director of the organization, a woman named Linda, welcomed me into their office, humbled but warm. She spoke to me about the struggles faced by women trapped in hopeless situations, about the courage and pain of those who found the strength to leave toxic relationships. "Many of them come to us with nothing," Linda said, a glimmer of sadness in her eyes. "They have nowhere else to go. I listened, touched by the stories she shared. Each of these women seemed to have faced her own fears and hardships, similar to mine, only far more painful. With each word she spoke, I felt a new resolve growing within me. I want to help, I said, feeling a surge of strength that I hadn't felt in years. Under Linda's guidance, I began using part of the inheritance to fund a new shelter. We developed a plan to create a place where women could find safety, support, and new hope. I realized that this money gave me not only the chance to rebuild my life but also to help other women find a way out of darkness, to give them a chance at a new beginning. A few weeks later, Linda invited me to the shelter's opening. It was a small but heartfelt event, filled with an atmosphere of hope. The people gathered around were full of gratitude and light. As the crowd began to disperse, I noticed a familiar face in the distance. It was Sarah, my former colleague from the library. She caught my eye and, smiling widely, headed toward me. "Helen. Is it really you?" she exclaimed in surprise, as if she couldn't believe her eyes. "Sarah." I replied, delighted, and, unable to resist, hugged her. "It's been so long. I'm so happy to see you." "What are you doing here?" she asked, glancing around the room with interest. I told her about the shelter, how I had started to be involved in its creation, and how it had become a new chapter for me. She listened with wide eyes, nodding in admiration. "That's incredible, Helen. I had no idea you'd found yourself in this. It's wonderful." "It truly is a new chapter for me," I said, smiling and feeling warmth spread throughout my body. We spent the whole evening talking, reminiscing about the past and catching up. It was so refreshing to reconnect with someone who knew me before everything I'd been through. It felt like, with her presence, the pieces of my life were slowly coming back together. As the event came to an end, Linda approached me, taking my hand with a look of gratitude in her eyes. "Helen, I can't express how grateful I am. This shelter will change the lives of so many women," she said, looking at me sincerely. I turned and looked at the faces of the women who had found refuge here, finding safety and peace that every person deserves. My heart swelled with warmth and a sense of purpose. "It's the least I could do," I whispered, feeling in my chest a peace and joy that I had long missed. Since then, my days have blended into a continuous, inspiring, and meaningful chain of events, filled with work at the shelter. Each new day brought a sense of purpose, strength, and significance, qualities that became an integral part of my new life. I was no longer just an observer of others' stories, I was becoming part of them. One day, while absorbed in my work, I heard my phone ring. The screen displayed a number I hadn't seen in a long time. It was Jack. My heart tightened with a sudden mix of emotions, memories, curiosity, even a touch of anxiety. I held the phone to my ear and said, trying to keep my tone steady, "Hello, Jack." "Helen, I need to talk to you." His voice sounded unexpectedly desperate. "Can we meet? It's important." Reluctantly, I agreed to meet him at a nearby cafe, hoping that a familiar setting would give me confidence. When I arrived, Jack was already waiting, seated by the window. He looked different, lost, defeated, almost pitiful. His eyes searched mine with barely hidden despair. "Helen," he began, his voice trembling, "I made a huge mistake. I want you to come back. I've realized how much you mean to me." I looked at him, and for the first time in a long while, I felt nothing. No pain, no regret, only a cold, indifferent disdain. "Why now, Jack? Why did you decide to tell me this now?" He sighed heavily, looking uncomfortable. "My parents, they always controlled everything. They were the reason our marriage fell apart. I was weak, but I've changed now. I'm different, Helen, truly." A wave of indignation swept over me. I remembered every moment of humiliation I'd endured because of him and his family, every dismissive word, every mocking look, and it all surged within me, transforming into righteous anger. "You're blaming your parents?" I asked with a bitter smile. "You were right there, Jack. You stayed silent while they treated me like dirt. You even laughed along with them." He reached for my hand, but I pulled back, refusing to let him cross that line again. "Please, Helen," he whispered, pleading. "I know I was wrong, but I've changed." I looked at him, at the man I once loved, but now he was only a shadow of that past I'd managed to leave behind. His words no longer touched my heart, they sounded empty and meaningless. "Changed or not, Jack," I said, keeping my tone icy, "it doesn't matter anymore. I feel nothing for you. Nothing but contempt." Jack paled, his gaze dimming as if everything he'd hoped to restore had shattered forever. His face fell, and for a moment, I glimpsed the Jack I had once married, the man who once made me believe in love. But the vision was fleeting, like a faint glimmer of days long gone. "I'm sorry, Jack," I said firmly, not breaking eye contact. "I have a new life now, I have a purpose, and there's no place in it for you." He nodded slowly, and in his eyes, I saw a resigned acceptance, as if he finally understood the irrevocability of my decision. "I understand," he replied quietly. "I just had to try." I stood up and walked out of the cafe, feeling the weight that had once pressed down on my shoulders lift completely. It was over. Truly over. The next day at the shelter, we had an important event. A local artist had donated a sculpture, and we were set to unveil it in a small garden we'd arranged for the women we served. I stood among people who were there for me, who supported and believed in me, and in that setting, I felt a sense of belonging, as if I'd found the family I'd always dreamed of. Sarah, my old colleague from the library, stood beside me, admiring the space I'd helped create, and with a smile, she said, "Helen, you've done something incredible here." Her words touched me deeply. And when the artist removed the covering to reveal a figure of a woman reaching toward the sky with grace and strength, I felt the symbolism. The sculpture embodied hope, new beginnings, and the strength each of us possesses to fight for our freedom. The air filled with applause, and for a moment, the world around me felt perfect. Linda, a woman who had become not only a mentor but a friend, came up to me with warmth in her eyes. "Helen, this is only the beginning," she said, embracing me. "We can do even more, even better." I looked around at the faces full of faith and hope, and I knew she was right. This was indeed my new beginning, and I was ready to embrace it wholeheartedly. Each day at the shelter brought challenges, but also rewards. My confidence grew, and I began to feel a strength that had once been stifled. I even signed up for self-defense classes, something that once seemed impossible for the quiet and reserved Helen. With each passing day, I grew stronger, knowing that I could now protect not only myself but also those in need of support. One day, as I was leaving the shelter after a busy day, I noticed a black car parked at the entrance. My heart stopped when I recognized it. It was Margaret's car, my former mother-in-law. The moment she saw me, she quickly got out and, avoiding my gaze, walked toward me. There was none of her former arrogance in her movements. "Helen, we need to talk," she said, her voice softer and quieter than I had ever heard it. I tensed, remembering everything I'd been through because of her and her family. "There's nothing for us to talk about, Margaret," I replied firmly, not letting her unsettle me. "Please, just hear me out." Her voice trembled, and as I stopped, I saw she seemed sincere, vulnerable. "I've realized how terribly wrong we were. I was so blind, and because of it, I lost my son. Now, I don't want to lose you, too." Her words made me pause. I could hardly believe what I was hearing, that this was coming from her, the woman who once deemed me unworthy of even a simple smile. "What do you want, Margaret?" I asked, still feeling wary of her. She took a deep breath, her eyes glistening with tears, but her voice remained soft and desperate. "I want to apologize, Helen. I treated you horribly, and I understand that now. I know it's too late, and I probably can't fix anything, but you were like the daughter I never had." Her eyes, filled with pain, stirred an unwelcome pang of sympathy in me. "Maybe," I said quietly, resisting her plea and softening gaze, but then I looked at her firmly. "Margaret, you made my life a living hell. I'm sorry, but an apology doesn't change the fact that I left. And maybe you should do the same, walk away and let the past go." Margaret took a step forward as if she were going to embrace me, but I stepped back, keeping a distance between us. Pain flashed in her eyes, but I knew the past couldn't be undone. "Please, Helen, I know I can't undo the past," she whispered, lowering her gaze, "but I want to make things right." I shook my head. Reconciliation had come to me long ago, and it didn't need her remorse. "It's too late, Margaret," I said firmly. "Goodbye." I turned and walked away, feeling her gaze on my back, but I didn't look back. From that moment on, I knew I could stand up for myself, and there was no going back to the life I had left behind. The next day, a letter arrived from Jack's lawyer. He was contesting the terms of our divorce. I wasn't surprised, but after years of struggle and new experiences, I was ready for this. My lawyer, Rachel, a confident, sharp woman, read through the papers and shook her head with a smile. "He has no grounds, Helen. The prenuptial agreement is clear. He's just trying to intimidate you." I nodded, feeling a surge of confidence that had taken root in my heart. "I'm not afraid of him anymore. We're going to win this." The day of the trial arrived, and I entered the courtroom with my head held high. Jack was already there, alongside his lawyer. When our eyes met, for a moment, I thought I saw the Jack I once loved, but he disappeared just as quickly, replaced by a stranger. The judge heard both sides and then delivered her decision. The prenuptial agreement would remain in effect, and Jack's claims were dismissed. I felt an incredible sense of relief and triumph, the feeling of finally conquering the past. After the session, Jack approached me. He looked embarrassed, his voice quieter than I was used to hearing. "Helen, I'm sorry. I was wrong." I looked at him, the man I once loved, and realized there was nothing left of those feelings. I nodded, feeling an odd calm. "Take care, Jack," I replied. With those words, I turned and walked out of the courtroom, knowing this chapter of my life was finally closed. The past was behind me, and ahead was a new life at the shelter, where I could help women who had also found the strength to break free from the chains of pain and fear. At the shelter, we were preparing for a fundraiser, and my life was buzzing with new energy. The support from the local community was overwhelming. People from all around wanted to contribute. When the night of the fundraiser arrived, the hall filled with bright faces and lively voices. People from all walks of life, from successful businesspeople to humble townsfolk, gathered to support our cause. I looked around, realizing how far I had come from the quiet, timid woman I once was. Sarah came up to me, her eyes shining with pride. "Helen, you did it. This is incredible." I smiled, squeezing her hand. "No, we did it, Sarah. And this is only the beginning. There's so much more ahead." As the evening continued, I felt warmth and gratitude fill my heart. This was now my life, my story, and I was exactly where I was meant to be, strong, free, and ready for new heights.